Hello and welcome to the third and final lecture of the 27th Goodman Lecture Series. I'm Francine McKenzie, Chair of the History Department, and today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Charlotte Gray. Before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Joanne Goodman Lecture Series. Joanne Goodman was a student in the History Department in the early 1970s. In the midst of her undergraduate studies, she died in a highway accident. The lecture series was established by her father, the Honorable Edwin Goodman, and his family in her honor and to perpetuate her memory. 2017 is the 42nd year of the Goodman Lectures. The series brings specialists of the transatlantic world, Canadian, British, and American history, to Western, where they explore important historical questions in 3 talks held on consecutive days. The format of the series, over 3 days, has meant that the lectures have been a platform to develop some major research projects that have resulted in publications. The list of the Goodman Lectures reads like a who's who of historians. The longevity of the series, the distinction of the speakers, the topics that have been explored, and the publications that the series has supported make the Joanne Goodman Lectures the most distinguished lecture series in Canada. This year, for the first time, the lectures are being live streamed. Today's speaker is Charlotte Gray, and she is a well-known popular historian who has published 10 books on Canadian history. She is particularly well-known as a biographer of many people, including Susanna Moodie, Pauline Johnson, Isabel Mackenzie King, and Alexander Graham Bell. Her most recent book is The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country. Now, in Charlotte's first 2 lectures, she explored the tension between history as entertainment and history as education, in both the writing of history and the production of history for television. She has related this to the role of history in creating national identity and a sense of community. The dynamics and the questions with which she is grappling with have existed for a long time, but they've arisen in a pressing way in light of the many activities that have been held this year to mark the Sesquicentennial. It's no surprise then that her final lecture looks at the Sesquicentennial. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming back Charlotte Gray for her 3rd and final lecture, Canada's Sesquicentennial, the Post-National Celebration.
Thank you, Francine, for that very nice introduction, and thank you once again to Western for inviting me to give these lectures. They've been fascinating for me to actually get my head around the subject of sort of what is popular history. So I was interested actually to have lunch today with a group of people in the public history, grads in the public history program here, and to discover that they too often are baffled by what popular history means. What is public history? But I hope that all of us have actually managed to come up with some answers this week. So in my first lecture, I spoke about the interdependence of popular and university-based historians, particularly when it comes to big history, the construction and promotion of national consciousness and mythologies. Writers of popular history, like Winston Churchill and Pierre Burton, depend on scholars for raw materials, analysis, original thinking. But scholars, consciously or unconsciously, depend on the populists to promote history as a subject worthy of general interest, and for some people, in-depth study. For the rest of us, a bare minimum of general knowledge about our country's past helps us understand its current values and debates, as well as our government's priorities. Yesterday, I moved on to how Canadian history has been presented on screen and how university-based historians and the general public have reacted to 3 particular programs in this country. I explored the challenges of presenting large-scale history in a country like Canada, where regional pressures are strong, national mythology is shallow, and narratives change in every generation. I suggested that the widening gulf between academic and general audiences is not a healthy sign for debates about Canadian identity or some of the urgent issues facing us today, including the so-called crisis in the humanities and the collapse of student enrollment in history faculties. In this final lecture, I want to talk about popular history in the year of Canada's Sesquicentennial. I'm now firmly focused on July the 1st, 2017, when we celebrated 150 years since the birth of Confederation, a time when we might have been expected to pay heightened attention to our national consciousness. But before we go there, I'd like to remind you of something I referred to yesterday, our current Prime Minister's interview with the New York Times immediately after his 2015 election. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defined Canada as, quote, the first post-national state with no core identity, no mainstream. Prime Minister Trudeau suggested to the New York Times that what characterizes Canadians is our, quote, openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. Now, these aspirational values are ones that I think all of us would be happy to claim. But where do these values that the Prime Minister says typify Canadians come from? The values themselves are not unique to Canada. Most of them are feel-good aspirations that could fit equally happily on government websites of several other countries. Hello, Scandinavia. Are we really so indistinguishable? What distinguishes Canada from, say, Sweden are episodes in our past that moved us towards becoming the complex community that we've become. Yes, we are a liberal democracy with deep respect for human rights, but it is our history and the circumstances in which we adopted those values that make this country unique. It's our history that underlies our political institutions, our economy, our culture, the way we see ourselves and relate to each other. And the way we see ourselves, our national consciousness, is constantly evolving. One example of the way that the stories we tell ourselves change over the years is the way that Canada Day is celebrated as an event that has become increasingly popular. Are we moving on? On July the 1st, 1867, the day when the Dominion of Canada came into being, festivities varied from one community to another. In Toronto, a whole ox was barbecued, and there was a big firework display. But in smaller communities, church bells rang out, though many residents were too busy bringing in the hay to join the fun. After that, Dominion Day, as it was then called, does not appear to have aroused much excitement, although it was declared a public holiday in 1879. Sir John A. Macdonald himself observed that Canada was, quote, a string of pearls, so fragile that the swift tug of any particular regional identity might pull it apart. Why try to construct an integrating mythology on which nobody could agree? The fragility was painfully obvious in 1908, when Quebec City celebrated its 300th anniversary. To avoid demonstrating that Quebec had lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the two reenactment armies simply marched past each other rather than restage a depiction of Quebec's ignominy. The first major federal celebration came in 1927, the 60th anniversary of Confederation. Are we there? Yes. The Prince of Wales arrived in Ottawa to inaugurate the Dominion Carillon in the recently opened Peace Tower on Parliament Hill. 50,000 people gathered on the hill to hear Prime Minister Mackenzie King speak. But the most noticeable feature of the celebration was that millions more heard him on a coast-to-coast broadcast via 23 radio stations. This was the start of the electronic age of messaging. In fact, the oldest recording in the CBC archives is an extract from that broadcast, 1927, in which both English and French were spoken, and which included a rendering of O Canada. It would take another 42 years before Canada became officially bilingual, another 53 years before O Canada became the national anthem, and 55 years before Dominion Day became Canada Day. Already, however, the National Day had been enlisted to consolidate a national consciousness. But it was a very British-style national consciousness. Part of the broadcast was a message of allegiance to the King and Queen in Britain. For the next quarter century, Dominion Day celebrations stayed pretty local. But that began to change after the Second World War. Shifting immigration patterns, closer ties with the United States, and a rising tide of nationalism within Quebec made Canadian identity look a bit shaky. As Matthew Hayday, professor of history at the University of Guelph, has discussed, from the mid-1950s onwards, government-sponsored celebrations of July the 1st became a case study of what kind of national identity the federal government of the day was promoting. Each successive version was a stage in the process, suggests Hayday, of, quote, creating linkages between Canadians and crafting the ideology and identity of the Canadian imagined community, to use political scientist Benedict Anderson's useful concept. The 1958 celebration reinforced Canada's British heritage. Conservative Prime Minister Diefenbaker's government authorized an event that consisted of an address by the Governor-General, a carillon concert from the Peace Tower, and a series of military band performances. Pretty stuffy. A bit of life slowly crept into Dominion Day shows on Parliament Hill. Amateur French-Canadian and English-Canadian choirs, and dance troupes from Ukrainian and Hungarian communities, as well as First Nations. After the Liberals took power in 1963, there was a greater emphasis on a bilingual celebration, broadcast coast to coast, plus more attention paid to representation from every province. But you know, once the hoopla of Canada's first century and Expo 67 had died down, the annual celebrations temporarily ran out of steam. The government shrank the funding, and CBC showed little interest in broadcasting the Ottawa show. In 1976, the government of Pierre Trudeau cancelled the show altogether in an austerity drive. But later the same year, Quebecers elected a Parti Québécois government. That changed everything, and the federal government leapt back into action. By 1978, the Canada Day budget had exploded, and the slogan for July the 1st was, Canada, it's you and me, Canada, c'est toi et moi. The declared intention of the event was national unity built on diversity. A national love feast, in the words of one organizer. As Professor Hayday observes, it would be hard to more pointedly capture the concept of Anderson's imagined community. From then on, Canada Day, as it was renamed in 1982, featured big-name stars, bilingual hosts, and multicultural diversity on Parliament Hill. The budget has ebbed and flowed ever since then, but hyper-patriotic frenzy and attachment to symbols remains. We don't seem to be advancing. Those of us who have been on the Hill or watched the national broadcasts on July the 1st in recent years will have vivid memories of maple leaf tattoos, flags, face paints, t-shirts, and of course the Mounties. This year's mega show included Gordon Lightfoot, Alicia Cara, Dean Brody, Serena Ryder, Buffy St. Marie, Cirque du Soleil, and Walk Off the Earth, as well as the Snowbirds and our two newest astronauts. Diversity, gymnastics, pop culture, science. The show presented a picture of modern Canada. The presence of the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales and his wife, was almost irrelevant. The evolving image presented of Canada during these festivities has not gone unchallenged. Back in the 1920s, British Columbia's Chinese communities organized Chinese Humiliation Day events as a counterpoint to Dominion Day festivities. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Quebec sovereigntists reshaped the religiously oriented St. Jean-Baptiste Day parades of June the 24th into the explicitly nationalist Fête Nationale to replace Canada Day. This year, some Indigenous leaders ostentatiously refused to partake in the Sesquicentennial festivities, arguing that they have no reason to celebrate Confederation. Nevertheless, the story about this country that we have told ourselves each Canada Day has morphed over the years alongside the country. The artfully curated self-image, brand Canada, if you like, has evolved from an identity rooted in British heritage to a land of talented individuals from diverse communities, united by the land on which they live and the values they share. Even the torrential downpours of Canada Day 2017 didn't dampen the enthusiasm of those who managed to get on the hill despite the security lineups. In the evening, the pyrotechnical show included fireworks with names like Crazy Canuck, All Dressed, and Double Double. Brand Canada. While thousands of Canadians lined up on the Rhine to get on the hill last July 1st, on the other side of the river, Ottawa River in Gatineau, the Canadian Museum of History was opening its new 4,000 square meter history hall. This museum welcomes over 1 million visitors a year, and for many of them, international tourists, Canadians who immigrated here as adults, this may be their only exposure to our history. Pretty sexy, eh? Indulge me in a moment of museum nostalgia here. When I was growing up in Sheffield, an industrial city in the north of England, I was often taken to the local museum. It was a typical English city museum in the 1950s, haphazard, badly lit, and usually deserted, perhaps because it was so relentlessly user-unfriendly. There was no gift shop or cafe. Nevertheless, my brother and I loved that museum. In the first gallery, there was a glass beehive attached to the window. This allowed us to watch bees crawling along a glass tube, then launch themselves through a hole in the plate glass and fly into the sooty city beyond. Meanwhile, others, legs coated in yellow pollen, dive-bombed back to the hole, as speedy as the tiny loaded Hankels that had recently bombed Sheffield. In the galleries beyond, there were further treasures, all examples of random donations: stuffed Mexican birds, an Australian duckbill platypus, colourful display cases of butterflies, collected by a Victorian city father. Other exhibits were more bizarre. The skull of a baboon that had lived in a monkey sanctuary at Neep's End and drowned in the Great Sheffield Flood of 1864. My brother and I knew Neep's End. It was close to the Truss Works, as my grandfather's surgical instrument factory was called, and we were aggrieved that it no longer boasted a monkey sanctuary. Best of all were the examples of Sheffield's greatest claim to fame, metalwork and silverware that had brought the city great wealth during and since the Industrial Revolution. For generations, my family had been involved in either steel making or the production of some of the vast range of tools and tableware that the city had exported all over the British Empire and beyond. We found our relatives' names on the knife blades, or saw our great-grandfather's name on the roll call of master cutlers. What did we get out of Sheffield City Museum? Unconsciously, we absorbed a sense of place, of the history of the industry, which was already in decline during my childhood, that underlay our middle-class comforts, and we got a sense of the civic pride of a steel city that had supplied the empire. It exposed us to authentic artifacts that had resonance for us, and we loved it. I suspect many people in this hall had similar experiences in their youth. By all accounts, the Old Royal Ontario Museum was a granny's attic full of such treasures. They all had dodos. In the last 30 years, museums have reinvented themselves, shifting away from being somber repositories of private collections and bequests towards being, quote, platforms for dialogue, user-friendly arenas for self-awareness. Visitors to most museums in 2017 are expected to come away not only with a mug from the gift shop, but also with a carefully curated perception of their world. Museum directors and their curators try to build visitor numbers by offering satisfying experiences and at the same time deliberately promote a message of community cohesion. They recognize that they run political institutions with underlying ideologies that, consciously or unconsciously, will be transmitted to visitors. I know that if a Marxist historian visited the old Sheffield City Museum, she or he would point out that it clearly reinforced the myth of capitalism as a benevolent force, allowing the steel barons to flourish and indulge pastimes such as butterfly collecting. The same critic would also point out which stories were not covered: environmental damage from filthy smokestacks, appalling slums that housed workers, and so on. There was certainly no deliberate messaging at the old Sheffield City Museum. But in 2017, it was obvious that the Canadian Museum of History could not be simply an attic of memorabilia. Its new history hall must have a message about Canada's national history. Most people here this afternoon will not yet have had a chance to visit the new hall in Gatineau. But you may recall its predecessor, which opened in 1989 in the midst of a national unity crisis. The old Canada Hall, as it was called, studiously avoided political history, skimming lightly over both the British conquest of New France in the 18th century and Confederation in the 19th century. Instead, it was characterized by static tableaus, a generic town square in New France, an Alberta schoolhouse for African American immigrants, a typical 19th century Ontario community, a CPR station on the prairies. Indigenous history was barely mentioned. Historians were unimpressed by this Disneyfied history, filled with reproduction pieces. Museum professionals questioned whether it fulfilled the traditional mandate for a museum, which includes the collection and preservation of artifacts and research. But the quasi-stage sets played well with those who knew no history, especially younger visitors. But by 2012, the original Canada Hall was tired. It had petered out with a tableau of mid-20th century Vancouver Airport. Since then, history had moved on in every sense. Both history scholarship and the country itself had changed dramatically. Depictions of 17th century Acadian women in aprons and early 19th century British immigrants furiously waving Union Jacks looked quaintly outdated, let alone sexist, racist, and pro-colonialist. This was not the 21st century Canadian self-image. But popular history, whether on the page, the screen, or the museum floor, requires a narrative, as we've seen. What story should a new history hall tell about Canada? The initiative got off to a bumpy start. In 2012, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced that his Conservative government was renaming the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and it was going to become the Canadian Museum of History, and then allocating $25 million for a new history hall, many commentators were deeply suspicious. The Harper government was then busy promoting Canada's ties with the monarchy and rebranding us as a warrior nation. Left-wing historians and indignant writers of letters to the editor protested that this was a cynical $25 million attempt to harness the past for political gain in the present. Nobody's ever done that before. Was the revamp going to show a Canada dedicated to such Tory priorities as hockey, British Royals, and the armed forces? Would this be the new national story? Such fears turned out to be way off the mark. Well before the Harper government was defeated, the designers of the new History Hall had gone in a completely different direction, echoing the changes we've seen in the academic world. Dogmatic, traditional narratives were now obsolete and irrelevant, museum staff explained. Last July, the museum's CEO, Mark O'Neill, proudly announced that the hall presented, quote, Canada's rich, complex, and multi-layered history through a variety of narratives and lenses. There is no single Canadian narrative and no one perspective on Canadian history. During the 5 years from gestation to official opening, museum staff had consulted close to 30,000 Canadians through town halls, interactive websites, panel discussions and surveys, as well as internal working groups. There were initially 6 external advisory groups composed of academics, Indigenous and cultural leaders, and community leaders. These were eventually whittled down to 2 committees, the Indigenous Committee and the General Working Committee. So you can see there was a lot of talking about what the story should be. The challenge was to distill all the opinions and expertise, which can easily be confused, into something that visitors might actually want to visit. I was a member of the General Advisory Committee. The other members were all university-based historians or educators, well respected in their fields. It was a fascinating exercise, as all participants tried to bridge the gap between scholarship and popular history, so that the History Hall might not be just informative, but also enjoyable for 7-year-olds drawn to real artifacts, whether they were Sheffield plated knives or Hudson Bay blankets. Some meetings I attended felt like graduate seminars in which I learnt material, language, and perspectives new to me. Other meetings resembled what I imagine a contemporary university faculty meeting to be like, each committee member arguing strenuously that his or her specialty, and those represented included military history, women's history, LGBTQ rights, immigration history, Quebec history, and Indigenous history, each specialist arguing that their material should not be elbowed out of the scrum for exhibition space. A couple of times the get-togethers felt like a provincial premier's smackdown, each participant championing their own territory with no one speaking for Canada. I did not envy Dr. David Morrison, Director of Research and Content for the Hall, whose job it was to adjudicate and absorb. As the redesign advanced, there was much discussion of wording and detail, devilish details. Why were we discussing First Nations creation myths, but Christian and other religions? Weren't we privileging European culture? Why were First Nations responses to state oppression described as, quote, militancy, while the actions of the FLQ, a terrorist organization, were smoothly subsumed into the story of Quebec nationalism? Should the fur trade be called the fur trade? It might have been all about beaver pelts for those busy hatters in London and Paris, but for the Cree, Ojibwe, and Anishinaabe and other traders on this side of the Atlantic, it was about cooking pots, blankets, knives, beads, guns. Another tricky question: how should the racist doctrines of 19th and 20th century Canada be presented? The museum had to display something more than moral outrage. There also had to be an indication that public values evolve over time and will continue to evolve. Sometimes debate got a little ferocious. One committee member complained that an early draft of the narrative line covered only, quote, poverty, greed, racist exploitation of people, the shameful abuse of resources, and the rape of the environment. It was a depressing tale of failed capitalist horror. Another member slammed the proposed narrative because, she said, it treated First Peoples as appendages to Euro-Canadian history instead of participants in their own way, and the way that Indigenous protests were framed was, quote, offensive. A third worried away like a dog with a bone about historical pedagogy. Visitors, especially students, must emerge with defined, quote, learning outcomes. The General Advisory Committee was only one component in the professional team that put the new History Hall together. We met twice a year, CMH staff and outside contractors worked full-time and towards the end 24/7. But the committee's comments helped shape the History Hall's direction. I was there as a popularizer. In books like Sisters in the Wilderness, Gold Diggers, and The Massey Murder, I have tried to bring history alive for general readers. I have learned how little general knowledge about Canadian history I can assume readers have. And I also know that a visit to a museum is meant to be entertaining as well as informative, a Saturday morning family outing, not a graduate seminar. So I was the populist asking obvious questions that reflected my own ignorance. Why, or what's that? Or particularly with academic jargon, what does that mean? I was pretty sure that if I was confused, the average visitor would be too. And although I relish groundbreaking scholarship, I knew that most Canadians would like a few recognizable landmarks, such as the fur trade, rather than the blanket and bead trade. So on many occasions I was the traditionalist, arguing for the older and more familiar narratives, while cutting-edge scholars, soaked in post-colonial reassessments, pushed for a change of perspective. But the most difficult question facing the History Hall designers was what to include, and more to the point, what to omit. Whose lives matter? It was understood that Indigenous history had to be in every gallery, but which particular Indigenous people or story? There was the usual tension between central Canada and the histories of the Maritimes, the West, British Columbia, and the North. If you heard me talking about Winston Churchill on Tuesday, you might recall that I quoted Churchill's relish for the way, quote, that the old legends keep on breaking through the mass of modern criticism which have been laid upon them. Which legendary episodes familiar to older Canadian audiences remained important and which could be relegated to the attic? I'm sorry, but I'm afraid that the 1917 Halifax explosion, a much-loved Historica Minute, was dumped. From the start, there was an emphasis on authentic artifacts, no more generic streetscapes, but would the choice of stories be driven by the availability of objects and oral histories? This would be fine for the early centuries, since the museum has an excellent collection of archaeological and anthropological artifacts, but it has collected little in recent years related to the 20th century. The History Hall team came up with a main message. It goes, quote, "This is the story of Canada, the stories of our country, what it is and how it got that way. It's a story of conflict, struggle and loss, success, accomplishment and hope. It's all around us and about us, and we shape its future." That sort of covers the bases, really, doesn't it? When I first read it, I wondered, the usual question about vaguely worded mission statements, what precisely it meant. But I realized that one important implication of this message was that the audience should engage with the past. Visitors should somehow see themselves and their place in this country in the new hall. They were constantly invited to identify with our country as we shape its future. The designers and curators wanted to tie the legacy of past events to our present lives so that museum goers would understand that history, the dreaded, boring history, is relevant to our lives today. The new Canadian History Hall is divided, which opened on July the 1st, is divided into 3 galleries. The first begins about 1300 years ago and ends with the British conquest of New France in 1763. The majority of material in this space relies on Indigenous cultural traditions and archaeological artifacts, presented in chronological order. Documentary evidence arrives with the French. Many of the most spectacular artifacts are found here. Gallery 2 takes the narrative from the British conquest to the eve of the First World War in 1914. Once again, it follows a chronological narrative, emphasizing the uneasy accommodation between British, French, and Indigenous peoples and commercial activities. Confederation is only one of the 6 stories dealt with in this gallery. So political history is firmly included, but more attention is paid to Canada's changing demographics, the waves of immigration, including Ukrainians, African Americans, Chinese and Japanese, plus restrictions on First Nations. Gallery 3, Modern Canada, generated the most controversy in our committee discussions. Given that all visitors would have personal or family connections to some of this gallery's contents, the stated mission of giving visitors a sense that this is their story was crucial here. Should the gallery focus on the downbeat, quote, conflict, struggle and loss part of that main message statement, or should it remind visitors of Canadian, quote, success, accomplishment and hope? It was the same question as runs through every popular history that tries to construct a national narrative, however fragmented. What kind of country do we live in? To put it crudely, should we beat ourselves up for past events now perceived as misdeeds, or should we congratulate ourselves on being such peaceable pragmatists? It's interesting that similar questions are being asked in many jurisdictions, especially other former British colonies, from Australia to India. And there have been fierce battles over both museums and history textbooks in both those countries. Gallery 3 begins chronologically with Canada's contribution to 2 world wars, its experience during the Depression, and its post-Second World War prosperity, including the growing role of government. However, the pace changes in the second half of the gallery. Here, 4 distinct themes are displayed autonomously: the failed, forced assimilation of First Peoples, Quebec nationalism and its impact on the rest of Canada, diversity and human rights and the struggles of marginalized groups, and Canada's international role. Much of the First Peoples module is told through Indigenous voices, describing the disastrous impact, immediate and long-term, of first contact, treaties and residential schools. The legacy of John A. Macdonald, who was treated as a hero in Gallery 2's Confederation section, is seen here as harsh and immoral. The Quebec module captures the ferocity of FLQ actions and the passion and tension of national unity debates. The diversity model includes material on discrimination against Chinese, Sikhs and Jews, as well as the fight for women's and LGBTQ rights, and its conclusion is the introduction of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Only in the 4th module, Canada's role internationally post-1945, is the Canadian state shown in a predominantly positive light. There was no consensus amongst advisory committee members about these plans. A couple of members argued that it ducked Canada's lingering identity as a former British colony, and that issues like homophobia and racism were not explored in sufficient depth. Another member said he did not recognize his country in the collection of sins and abuses on display. If Canada was such a land of injustice, why were thousands of would-be refugees and immigrants lining up at our borders? The Modern Canada Gallery ends on an upbeat note. It begins this note: Today's Canada is one of the world's most admired countries. Its reputation and public image reflect stability and compassion, natural beauty and political freedom. It is an extraordinary work in progress. However, the message goes on to solemnly acknowledge, quote, a contested past. It's important to acknowledge that different groups have different perspectives, but I'm not sure what the phrase contested past, wrenched from academic discourse, will mean to most visitors, especially school parties. So far, I haven't seen any scholarly analyses of the new History Hall. I am afraid that many scholars will look only at those displays related to their research interests and pronounce them superficial. But I've visited it several times myself, and I'm impressed. It has enough stuff that my 7-year-old self would have enjoyed while situating the artifacts in a larger story. But the main audience for a national museum is the general public. How has it reacted? Does the hall engage an audience that may not have been born here, may not know there was once another Prime Minister called Trudeau, and probably cannot recall the Quebec referendum of 1995, let alone Expo 67. Will the museum resonate with and shape the national consciousness of Canadians of different backgrounds? The History Hall is certainly popular. In its first 9 months, it received 160,000 visitors, which is an increase of 25% over the same period for the old hall last year. Most TripAdvisor comments have been extremely positive, particularly about the nifty touch screens and the integration of Indigenous history. There have been a handful of less enthusiastic reactions, particularly from those who were simply overwhelmed by the depth and richness. One TripAdvisor review described the new hall as uninspiring and too dark, while another regretted the disappearance of the iconic grain elevator in the old Canada Hall. I watched a handful of visitors find links between today and yesterday in the way that the hall's designers hoped, but didn't always expect. A high school student told CBC's Cross Country Checkup that he was happy to see in Gallery 1 that the ancient Dorset people overlapped with the Inuit on the north of this continent thousands of years ago, which, he suggested, means Canada has always been multicultural. A Chinese Canadian woman was amazed to see that 20th century Canadians discriminated against Jews as well as Chinese immigrants. She said to me, "I mean, we Chinese look different, but Jewish people look the same as you. So what's racism all about?" Another woman, who had spent much of her career in public history, said that the residential school section made her cry. An older visitor complained bitterly that Gallery 3 had been designed by social justice warriors. The History Hall presents a very 21st century narrative of Canadian history. It downplays British links, Anglo-French fiction, and Canada's contribution to 20th century wars. Its third gallery highlights Justin Trudeau's preoccupations: diversity, inclusiveness, and Indigenous history. Will it be a popular success? Or will it be regarded as a visual version of Buckley's cough medicine? Unpleasant tasting, but good for you. Might it at least help to create curiosity about our past, if not a better general knowledge? The jury is still out. But as every historian should know, we must put this new version in context. This 2017 selfie will age over the next 25 years, as did its predecessor. By the 175th anniversary of Confederation, there will be new events to either deplore or celebrate, or both. Today's attempts to shape national consciousness through popular history will have been left behind. My own contribution to this sesquicentennial year was my book, The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country. This is the first book in which I attempted big history. In my previous books, I focused on a particular individual or event. The Mohawk poet Pauline E. Johnson, for instance, or the 1890s Klondike Gold Rush, and then used my subject as the lens through which to illuminate a particular period or region. The Promise of Canada was much more ambitious. I wanted to explore, for a large readership, the evolution of the entire country since Confederation. I adopted an unusual narrative strategy. I dodged the challenge of a single national story. Instead, I forwarded the years from 1867 until 2017 by using as stepping stones mini-biographies of people who, in different ways, contributed to the evolving Canadian identity. I began with Georges-Étienne Cartier, then rolled through the next 150 years, one individual representing each generation, until I arrived at 2017. The final chapter covers a range of contemporary Canadians, from Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi to Ontario businesswoman Annette Vercheron. I embedded each individual into a larger narrative of Canada's development. This approach allowed me to describe the Canada of each subject's childhood through their eyes, rather than through an exclusively 2017 lens, and then to assess their achievements within the context of their day. This was the way I was taught history, understand people and events within the context of the times and the choices available to them. Don't rush to judgments. Some of my choices were well known to most Canadians. Artist Emily Carr, Medicare champion Tommy Douglas, writer Margaret Atwood, politician Preston Manning. Others had disappeared from popular memory. Colonel Sam Steele of the Mounties, historian Harold Innis, lawyer Justice Bertha Wilson, OG Cree leader Elijah Harper. Why did I choose these individuals? I did a very personal analysis of what I considered the key characteristics of modern Canada, and then I looked for individuals who had either introduced specific ideas into the collective psyche or who had symbolized important aspects of this country. Since federalism is the foundation of our system of government, I chose to begin with Georges Etienne Cartier, who had championed a federal system for the new Dominion of Canada in the 1860s, long before John A. Macdonald got there. My next choice was Steele of the Mounties, because the Northwest Mounted Police were the first all-Canadian institution, and they embody this country's tradition of law and order. No one can try and pin this country onto page or screen without acknowledging its vast and extraordinary landscape. Artist Emily Carr captured not only the mystery of the Northwest Pacific rainforests, but also the existence of its indigenous peoples. And so I continued through successive generations, examining the sinews of our economy, our embrace of a tax-funded healthcare system, our blossoming literature, regional tensions and populism, growing respect for individual rights and freedoms, and the struggles of Indigenous peoples to make their voices heard. However, I used all the skills of a biographer to bring my readers into my subjects' lives. How did Emily Carr's own upbringing as an ornery tomboy on the outer fringes of the British Empire spark her respect for the Haida, Gitxsan, and Tsimshian peoples? How did Harold Innis's resentment of British officers in First World War trenches convince him that Canada should build a future independent of the mother country? Where did Nahid Nenshi, Muslim son of Tanzanian immigrants, find the confidence to run for mayor in the city of Calgary? My goal was to give readers different ways to think about Canada and to add new layers to popular knowledge of our history, and of course to make it an engaging read. Over my writing career, I have discovered that readers will plunge into any vicarious new experience or think about new ideas if they can be shown the action through a participant's eyes. In the words of Benjamin Disraeli, read no history, nothing but biography, for that is life without theory. Of course, by the very act of selecting these particular Canadian characteristics and individuals, I was skewing the narrative. Why was there no industrialist or scientist among my subjects? Why had I not included one 20th century Quebecer through whose point of view I could explore the national unity crisis? I had made a deliberate decision not to include any prime ministers. Most readers seemed extraordinarily grateful. But a much bolder decision was to exclude hockey players too. The absence of a Rocket Richard or Wayne Gretzky turned out to be particularly shocking. At book events, I was frequently told that Canada is all about hockey. But as an individual author, I had none of the constraints that face a government institution or broadcasting corporation. This was not history by committee, this was my book. I've had far more traffic on my website for this book than for any of my previous books, partly a function, in my view, of the growing appetite for engagement and dialogue that the internet has bred, and which the designers of the History Hall were so keen to harness. Obviously, it's gratifying for an author to hear from happy readers, although I also realize that disgruntled readers presumably think that contacting an author is a waste of their time. But I was discouraged by the number who made it plain that they don't normally like history, hadn't expected to enjoy the book, and had acquired it only out of a sense of sesqui-duty. And a shocking number wrote about their ignorance of Canadian history, despite everything I have spoken of over the past 3 days. Books by Pierre Burton, heritage minutes, history docudramas, on the national broadcaster, national celebrations, and museums. One reader's comment that I treasure but find poignant was, quote, "I felt as though I was discovering my country for the first time." No wonder that we have seen this year outbreaks of the kind of ahistorical thinking that most of us here find pretty depressing. I'm talking, of course, about the debate over whether Sir John A. Macdonald's name should be stripped from public schools that bear it. Our first Prime Minister is not alone in this public shaming. The name of his fellow Father of Confederation, Sir Hector Langevin, Minister of Public Works in Macdonald's cabinet, was stripped from a government building in Ottawa. Egerton Ryerson, once celebrated as the champion of free and compulsory schooling in Upper Canada, fell under the same cloud, the cloud of supporting the residential school system. Angry advocates have suggested he certainly does not deserve to have a university named after him, even though he spent most of his career championing such 21st century principles as civic equality, religious freedom, and public education. I'm not going to go into the debates that these names have generated, these names and others, and how the legacy of each man might be judged. As you might guess, I support the idea that we should regularly re-examine the reputations of our predecessors, but I don't agree that they should immediately be cast into the outer darkness if they don't meet today's standards in every aspect of their decisions and careers. No single individual embodies everything we want them to. Life is complicated, which is why John A. Macdonald is a hero at one point in the new History Hall and a villain at another point. As a writer of popular history books, I'm more interested in the larger question of what Canadians think history is. For most of us, it is not a prosecutorial narrative, a whodunit in the style of a Louise Penny novel in which we can play Inspector Armand Ganache and discover the smoking gun, the quote from Ryerson or from Macdonald that suggests he was bent on an Indigenous Holocaust. Nor is it a context-free dive into the minutiae of a single aspect of the past to be written up as a scholarly monograph written for an audience that might fit in this room. Instead, for most of us, history is the tangled weave of stories we choose to pull out of the inchoate past and tell ourselves. These stories are complicated and intriguing, some inspiring, some very dark indeed, and they say a lot about ourselves and our world. They can help contemporary Canadians understand how today was shaped by yesterday and where we might go tomorrow. The history of this land goes back thousands of years, and it is because of particular events, struggles, and past lives that Canada in 2017 is one of the world's most prosperous and admired countries. Canadian history can be intellectually challenging as we try to understand different eras. It can be suffused with ideology, filled with pulpit punching, or it can be drenched in media sentimentality. Our history can be the raw material of great art in such novels as Jane Urquhart's Away, Lawrence Hill's Book of Negroes, or Guy Vanderhey's The Last Crossing. It can be a cultural pleasure, like listening to Mozart or studying astronomy. It can be used to construct an imagined community, as I hope I've demonstrated over the past 3 days. Yes, these stories require constant renegotiation and adaptation as the country evolves and changes. Gone are the days when the likes of Arthur Lower and Abbé Groux told us what our history was. We are now engaged in a healthy, sometimes abrasive dialogue about who we are. Our historians, museums, and documentary makers act as the interpreters, the prism for this ever-shifting tale. However, these stories, our history, are an important part of the present as well as the past. I certainly do not endorse the view that Canada is a, quote, post-nation state with no core identity, even if we share a far more pluralistic, accommodating set of values than, say, the city fathers of my hometown, Sheffield. The post-nation slogan strikes me as an easy way to duck hard questions and slide into a dangerous amnesia. This country has actually proved much sturdier and more resilient than anyone might have expected. So it's worth asking, how did that happen? And it's worth supplying a smorgasbord of answers that Canadians might actually want to sample. Where will most of our fellow citizens be able to find such a smorgasbord? They will look to historians, scholars, and popularizers to pull out those stories. That is why the need in Canada for public historians, especially from universities like Western, has never been so great. But university history departments, as I've said, are shrinking, jobs are drying up, and leadership positions in the world of popular history, in museums, publishing, or filmmaking, are increasingly filled with either non-historians or with people recruited from outside the country. It's a vicious spiral. The less we invest in public history, the fewer opportunities there are for Canadians to learn about our roots. Joanne Goodman was, by all accounts, a gifted and keen student who loved history. Perhaps if she were here today, she would already be in one of those leadership positions. Perhaps she would be filling the vacuum that Canada faces, the lack of discussion about how the past is present. Perhaps she would be helping to formulate answers to the question, how did we get here, in ways that Canadians will want to embrace, in video, on the page, in museums, or in the sky with fireworks. It's a tragedy that she's not here, but many other students have gone through the wonderful history program at Western University, and I hope they will continue to pursue their own interest in our collective past and champion its importance for this country's national consciousness. Thank you.